What if the woman everyone mocked at a luxury gala was the one person an Arab billionaire had spent years trying to find? "You've got to be kidding!" Claire Whitmore laughed, loud enough for the entire ballroom to hear. "That's who they paired him with?" Madeline Brooks froze. Her cheap black dress suddenly felt too tight, too small, too noticeable. Around her, wealthy guests whispered behind champagne glasses, their smirks growing sharper as she approached the VIP table. Because sitting there, silent, powerful, impossible to read, was Zayed Rahman. The mysterious Arab investor every woman in the room had been trying to impress all night. Claire leaned closer to her friends and whispered, "Watch this. He'll send her away in less than 30 seconds. The ballroom buzzed with cruel anticipation. But then, Zayed slowly stood up, not with disgust, not with embarrassment. He pulled out the chair beside him, looked directly into Madeline's trembling eyes, and said something that made the entire room fall silent. "You're the only beautiful thing I've seen tonight." Nobody breathed, because no one knew who he really was, and nobody expected what happened next. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. And don't forget to subscribe, because this story might completely change the way you see people forever. Chicago glittered differently at night. From the upper floors of the Blackstone Imperial Hotel, the city looked untouchable. Rivers of gold stretching beneath skyscrapers, luxury cars sliding through wet streets, chandeliers glowing behind walls of glass. To the wealthy guests arriving for the Whitmore Foundation Charity Gala, it was another glamorous evening filled with expensive wine, fake smiles, and strategic conversations disguised as friendship. But 3 floors below the ballroom, in the overheated bakery kitchen, Madeline Brooks was fighting tears while frosting miniature lemon cakes. "Table 16 sent theirs back again," a waiter muttered, dropping the tray beside her. "Said they looked too cheap." Madeline inhaled slowly. The cakes were perfect. She knew they were. But she also knew arguing would only make things worse. "Okay," she whispered softly. "I'll redo them." The waiter shrugged and walked away without another word. Madeline kept her eyes lowered as she fixed the desserts with careful hands. Her white chef jacket was dusted with flour, and loose strands of chestnut-brown hair clung to her forehead from the heat. She had been working since 5 that morning, and her back ached from standing all day. Still, she kept going, because she needed this job. Her father's hospital bills had nearly destroyed them after his second heart surgery. The small apartment she rented on the south side barely stayed warm during winter. Every extra shift mattered. Across the kitchen, 2 younger employees whispered while pretending not to stare at her. "I heard Claire Whitmore specifically asked for skinny servers tonight," one girl said quietly. The other snorted. "Then why is Madeline even here?" A few people laughed. Madeline pretended not to hear. That was what she always did. She had learned long ago that humiliation lasted longer when people saw it hurt you. So she smiled, even when it hurt. Upstairs, meanwhile, another guest was arriving at the gala. Zayed Rahman stepped out of a black SUV without security, assistants, or photographers. Rain shimmered across the sidewalk as he adjusted the collar of his dark coat and glanced up at the enormous hotel. Nobody near the entrance recognized him. And that was exactly how he wanted it. The billionaire owner of Rahman Global Holdings had spent the last year disappearing from public life after a brutal scandal involving his former fiancée and several business partners. Headlines had mocked him across international media. Arab billionaire betrayed by inner circle. Multi-million-dollar engagement ends in public humiliation. Since then, Zayed trusted almost no one, especially people attracted to wealth. Tonight's gala was supposed to be simple. Anonymous observation. A quiet evaluation of the Blackstone Imperial before purchasing controlling shares. Nothing more. But the moment he entered the ballroom, he already felt exhausted. Women in designer gowns smiled too quickly. Investors bragged too loudly. Every conversation felt rehearsed. "Mr. Rahman?" A sharply dressed man approached him immediately with an extended hand. "Noah Bennett, general manager of the hotel. We're honored to have you here tonight," Noah said nervously. "Please let us know if you need absolutely anything." Zayed gave a polite nod. "Thank you," Noah lowered his voice. "Miss Claire Whitmore is very eager to meet you." Of course she was. Zayed had heard enough about the Whitmore family already. Wealthy, influential, obsessed with appearances, the kind of people he had grown tired of years ago. Across the ballroom, Claire Whitmore noticed him instantly. Tall, composed, dangerously handsome. Even in a simple black suit, Zayed carried the kind of presence money could never buy. Claire's eyes widened slightly. "That has to be him," she whispered. Her friends turned. One of them nearly choked on champagne. "Oh my God," Claire smiled slowly. The mysterious billionaire investor everyone had been trying to impress all month was sitting alone near the ballroom windows, and unlike the other men in the room, he seemed completely uninterested in attention, which only made him more attractive. "I'm going over there," Claire announced. "You've already scared off 2 hedge fund managers tonight." Another woman laughed. Claire smirked confidently. "Trust me, men like him always look eventually." Meanwhile, downstairs, Madeline carefully carried a tray of desserts toward the service elevator. Grace Holloway, an older waitress with tired eyes and silver-streaked hair, stopped her gently. "You okay, sweetheart?" Madeline forced a smile. "Of course." Grace studied her face for a moment. "You don't have to pretend with me." For a second, Madeline almost admitted how exhausted she felt, how lonely she felt, how every cruel comment slowly carved pieces out of her confidence. But before she could answer, Noah Bennett stormed into the kitchen. "Why are those desserts not upstairs yet?" he barked. "They're ready now," Madeline said quickly. Noah's eyes scanned her appearance critically. Then his expression changed, almost like an idea had just entered his mind. Upstairs, Claire was already failing miserably. Zayed answered her flirtatious questions with short, polite responses. Nothing more. "So," Claire said, leaning closer, "Chicago must feel boring compared to Dubai." "It depends on the people," Zayed replied calmly. The subtle rejection irritated her instantly. Then she noticed something. Across the ballroom entrance, Madeline stepped out carrying the dessert tray. Claire stared at her for a second before slowly smiling. Not kindly, cruelly. One of her friends noticed. "Oh no," the woman whispered. "What are you thinking?" Claire laughed softly. "You said he doesn't react to beautiful women." Her eyes locked onto Madeline. "Let's see how he reacts to her." The women burst into quiet laughter. Moments later, Noah hurried toward Madeline before she could return downstairs. "Change of plans," he said quickly. Madeline blinked. "What? You're delivering desserts directly to the VIP table." Her stomach tightened immediately. I'm not supposed to serve guests." "You are tonight." Something about Noah's tone felt strange. Around the ballroom, several socialites suddenly began watching her, whispering, smirking. Madeline felt heat rise into her cheeks. "What's going on?" she asked nervously. Noah forced a fake smile. "Relax, it's just dinner." But across the room, Claire lifted her champagne glass toward her friends. The trap had already begun. And at the center of it, without understanding why every eye in the ballroom suddenly seemed fixed on her, Madeline Brooks started walking toward Zayed Rahman's table. The ballroom suddenly felt too quiet, too bright. too aware of her existence. Madeline Brooks tightened her grip on the silver dessert tray as she crossed the marble floor beneath the enormous crystal chandeliers. Every step felt heavier than the last. She could feel people watching her from every direction. Not kindly. Never kindly. Whispers followed behind her like smoke. Is that one of the kitchen girls? Why would they send her there? Oh, this should be entertaining. Claire Whitmore lowered her champagne glass, barely hiding her smile. Beside her, two women struggled not to laugh. Madeline tried focusing on the desserts instead of the voices around her. Tiny lemon cakes, gold sugar flakes, fresh raspberries, perfectly arranged. Safe. The desserts made sense. People didn't. When she finally reached the VIP table near the windows, her breath caught slightly. Zayed Rahman looked even more intimidating up close. Tall, calm, dark-eyed. There was something strangely unreadable about him. While everyone else in the ballroom constantly performed for attention, he sat in complete silence, observing the room like a man who already understood too much. Madeline quickly lowered her gaze. "Dessert service," she said softly. Zayed looked at the tray, then at her trembling hands, and for the first time that evening, something in his expression shifted. Not judgment, recognition. "You made these yourself?" he asked. His voice was low and controlled, but unexpectedly warm. Madeline blinked in surprise. "Yes, they're beautiful." The compliment hit her harder than it should have, because it sounded genuine. Not mocking, not forced. Real. Before she could respond, Claire suddenly approached the table with several guests behind her. "There you are," Claire said brightly, placing a manicured hand against her chest. "We were wondering why Mr. Rahman was sitting all alone." Zayed's expression cooled immediately. Claire ignored it. Then her eyes slid toward Madeline. "Oh," she said with fake surprise, "you're still here." A few nearby guests chuckled quietly. Madeline's cheeks burned. "I was just serving dessert," she murmured. "Nonsense," Claire replied loudly enough for surrounding tables to hear. "You should stay. Mr. Rahman seems to enjoy the company." The word sounded polite, but the tone beneath them was cruel. Madeline immediately understood. This was a game, and she was the joke. "No, I should get back downstairs," she said quickly. But before she could move, Zayed calmly spoke. "Sit down." The room seemed to pause. Madeline stared at him. I can't. You can." His voice remained calm. Certain. He slowly pulled out the empty chair beside him. The exact moment from the hook unfolded again, but this time, the tension felt even sharper. Around the ballroom, heads turned openly now. Phones quietly lifted beneath tables. Claire's smile widened with anticipation. She expected rejection, humiliation, embarrassment. Instead, Zayed waited patiently beside the chair, as if none of the whispers around them mattered. Madeline's pulse pounded painfully. Every instinct told her to run, but something about the way he looked at her made leaving impossible. Reluctantly, she sat down. The ballroom erupted into hushed disbelief. "Oh my God, is this actually happening?" Claire exchanged amused glances with her friends. "This is unbelievable," one woman whispered. Madeline kept her eyes lowered as waiters began serving the next course. She could practically feel the judgment pressing against her skin from every direction. "So, Madeline," Claire said sweetly, "how long have you been working in the kitchens?" "A little over 3 years. And do you enjoy it?" Madeline nodded carefully. "Yes." Claire tilted her head. "That's nice. It's important for people to know where they belong." A few guests laughed into their wine glasses. Madeline's stomach twisted. Zayed noticed. His fingers tightened slightly against the tablecloth, but he remained silent. For now. Another man leaned forward smugly. "So, what exactly do you do?" he asked Madeline. "Besides desserts, she takes care of her father," Grace Holloway suddenly said from nearby while refilling water glasses. The older waitress's voice carried unexpected firmness. Claire's eyes narrowed instantly. Nobody had invited Grace into the conversation. Madeline looked embarrassed. "It's fine," she whispered quietly toward Grace. But the damage was already done. "Aw," Claire said mockingly. "That's actually kind of sweet." Madeline stared down at her untouched plate. She hated this feeling. Being displayed, measured, reduced to entertainment. Then another guest smirked. "You know," he said loudly, "this might be the quietest charity gala Chicago's ever seen." Claire laughed. "Well, everyone's trying very hard not to say the wrong thing." More laughter spread around the table. Even Noah Bennett awkwardly forced a smile nearby. Only Zayed remained expressionless. Madeline could barely breathe now. Every cruel joke reopened old wounds she spent years trying to hide. Middle school locker room laughter. College boys pretending to flirt as a prank. Co-workers whispering behind bakery shelves. Blind dates leaving early. The memories stacked painfully inside her chest. And somehow tonight felt worse than all of them. Because for one stupid moment, when Zayed complimented her desserts, she had almost forgotten what people were really like. A waiter suddenly approached, carrying red wine. Madeline reached carefully for her glass. Then it happened. The waiter accidentally slammed into her shoulder. The entire glass of wine poured directly across the front of her black dress. Gasps spread through the ballroom. Madeline froze. Cold wine dripped slowly across her chest and lap. The waiter stepped back dramatically. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry." But his expression betrayed him. This wasn't an accident. Claire immediately covered her mouth to hide a smile. Several guests burst into quiet laughter. Someone actually pulled out a phone. Madeline's face turned scarlet. "I'm sorry," she whispered automatically, even though she had done nothing wrong. Her chair scraped backward. "I should go." Nobody stopped her. Nobody except Zayed. Without a word, he stood up. The entire ballroom fell silent again. Madeline looked horrified. "Please," she whispered. "Don't." But Zayed calmly removed his dark suit jacket and placed it gently around her shoulders. The movement was simple, quiet, yet somehow it changed the entire atmosphere of the room. Nobody laughed now, because the expression on Zayed's face had become dangerous. Not angry in a loud way. Worse. Controlled. Cold. He looked directly at the waiter. "Did she spill the wine?" he asked softly. "Or did you?" The waiter immediately turned pale. It was an accident, sir." Zayed said nothing, but everyone suddenly seemed uncomfortable. Claire shifted in her seat. For the first time all evening, uncertainty flickered behind her eyes. Madeline tried standing again. "I really should leave." Zayed looked at her carefully, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter than before. Almost personal. "Why?" he asked. "Do you let people treat you like this?" The question hit her harder than the humiliation itself. Madeline stared at him speechlessly, because nobody had ever asked her that before. And deep down, she wasn't sure she knew the answer. The ballroom no longer sounded the same. The laughter had faded. The smug whispers had quieted. And yet Madeline Brooks somehow felt even more exposed than before. Zayed Rahman's jacket rested around her shoulders, still warm from his body. The expensive fabric smelled faintly of cedarwood and rain, and for reasons she couldn't explain, That only made her more emotional. Because nobody had defended her like this before. Not publicly. Not when it cost them something. "I should really go downstairs," she whispered again. But Zayed remained standing beside her chair. No, the word wasn't controlling. It was protective. That frightened her even more. Claire Whitmore forced an uncomfortable laugh from across the table. "Well," she said brightly, "this evening suddenly became dramatic." Nobody answered her. Several guests avoided eye contact entirely now. Even Noah Bennett looked nervous. Zayed slowly sat back down. Then, without taking his eyes off Madeline, he asked quietly, "Did anyone ever teach you that apologizing for existing becomes a habit?" Madeline blinked. The question caught her completely off guard. "I'm not apologizing for existing," she said softly. "Aren't you?" His tone wasn't cruel, just honest. And somehow honesty hurt worse. Madeline looked away toward the ballroom windows where rain streaked across the Chicago skyline like blurred silver lines. She hated conversations like this, conversations that reached beneath the surface, because once people looked deep enough, they usually found something disappointing. "You don't know me," she murmured. Zayed's expression barely changed. "No," he agreed, "but I know humiliation when I see it." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The music from the ballroom orchestra drifted softly through the silence. Somewhere behind them, glasses clinked awkwardly as guests tried pretending dinner hadn't just turned uncomfortable. Finally, Madeline inhaled shakily. "When you grow up looking like me," she said carefully, "people teach you certain things." Zayed remained silent. "You learn not to expect kindness for free." Her voice stayed calm, but years of pain hid underneath every word. "You learn that people become uncomfortable if you're too confident. You learn that if someone attractive talks to you, there's probably a joke coming afterward." Claire shifted uncomfortably nearby. Madeline continued anyway, and eventually, she swallowed hard, "you start trying to make yourself smaller before other people do it for you." The words hit the table like stones. Even the nearby guests listening secretly stopped moving, because there was something deeply unsettling about hearing someone describe emotional destruction so calmly. Zayed studied her face carefully. Not her weight, not her dress. Her face. As though he were trying to understand how many years of pain lived behind her eyes. "Who taught you that?" he asked quietly. Madeline almost laughed. "Everybody." The honesty in her answer seemed to affect him more than she expected. His jaw tightened slightly, and for the first time that evening, a shadow crossed his expression. A memory. Far away. Painful. Claire quickly interrupted before the silence deepened further. "Well," she said lightly, "we've all been bullied at some point." Madeline looked down immediately, but Zayed turned toward Claire slowly. "No," he said calmly. "Not like this." The room fell silent again. Claire's smile weakened. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Then Zayed surprised everyone, including Madeline. "What would you do?" he asked her quietly. "If money wasn't a problem?" Madeline frowned slightly. "What? If nobody could laugh at you anymore," he continued, "what would you build for yourself?" The question felt so unexpected that she forgot to guard herself, and before she realized it, she answered honestly, "A bakery." Claire rolled her eyes immediately. How original. But Zayed ignored her completely. Madeline looked embarrassed now. "It's stupid." "No," he said softly. "It isn't." She hesitated before continuing. "I used to sketch designs between shifts." Her cheeks reddened slightly. Desserts, store layouts, seasonal menus. Something in Zayed's expression sharpened with interest. You still have them? Madeline nodded carefully. In my locker downstairs. For the first time that night, genuine curiosity appeared in his eyes. What kind of bakery? The question sounded simple, but nobody had ever asked her that seriously before. Madeline slowly relaxed without realizing it. A small one, she admitted. Warm lighting, fresh bread at sunrise, coffee that actually tastes good. A faint smile touched her lips. Somewhere people don't feel judged walking in. The sentence lingered heavily between them, because both of them understood it meant far more than pastries. Zayed leaned back slightly, still watching her closely. And the desserts? Madeline laughed softly under her breath. That's the easy part. The sound surprised him. It was small, gentle, real. Not polished like the artificial laughter surrounding them all evening. For a brief second, he could almost imagine a different version of life. One without cameras, without contracts, without betrayal. Years earlier, Zayed had once believed love and loyalty could survive wealth. Then his former fiancée sold private information about his family to tabloids during their engagement. He still remembered the headlines. Still remembered standing beneath flashing cameras while reporters shouted questions about humiliation and greed. After that, every smile felt calculated. Every compliment sounded expensive. But Madeline spoke like someone who had long ago stopped expecting miracles. And strangely, that honesty felt safer than luxury ever had. Across the ballroom, Claire noticed the way he looked at Madeline. Not with pity, with interest. That terrified her. She quickly excused herself from the table. I'll be right back. One of her friends followed immediately. The moment they disappeared near the hallway entrance, Claire grabbed the woman's wrist tightly. Find out who he is, she hissed. What? Now. He's obviously rich. I know that, Claire snapped. But nobody acts like that unless they're powerful. The woman quickly pulled out her phone. Meanwhile, back at the table, Madeline slowly removed Zayed's jacket. You should take this back. No, you'll be cold. I'm fine. Madeline hesitated. Why are you being nice to me? The question was almost heartbreaking in its sincerity. Zayed looked at her for several seconds before answering. Because everyone else here is trying too hard to be impressive. His eyes lowered briefly toward the stained wine across her dress. You're the only person tonight who seems real. Madeline's chest tightened unexpectedly. Nobody had ever described her that way before. Real. Before she could respond, Claire suddenly returned to the ballroom. But this time, the color had drained from her face. Her breathing looked uneven, and when her eyes locked onto Zayed again, the confidence she carried earlier was completely gone. Because the message on her phone contained only 4 words. Zayed Rahman. Net worth. 11.4 billion. Claire stared at him in disbelief, then slowly back at Madeline. And for the first time all evening, panic entered her eyes. Claire Whitmore did not sleep that night. The moment she returned home from the gala, she threw her heels across her penthouse apartment and stared at the photos spreading across social media. Everywhere she looked, there they were. Madeline Brooks and Zayed Rahman. The mysterious billionaire standing beside the plus-size pastry chef while the ballroom stared in disbelief. Somebody had uploaded a short video of him placing his jacket around her shoulders. Millions of views were already climbing by the hour. The comments were brutal. Did she trap him? She knew exactly what she was doing. Another gold digger story. But worse, some people were defending Madeline, calling her real, calling her beautiful. Claire's jaw tightened furiously. That should have been impossible. The entire point of the prank had been humiliation. Entertainment, not sympathy, and certainly not admiration. "She's ruining everything," Claire muttered. Across the room, Damien Whitmore lowered his whiskey glass. Her wealthy fiancé had spent most of the gala networking with investors and barely noticed the emotional chaos unfolding until reporters began asking questions afterward. "You're overreacting," Damien said calmly. Claire turned toward him sharply. "Do you understand who that man is?" Damien frowned. "Of course I do." "No, you don't." She shoved her phone toward him. "Raman Global is worth billions. Billions. If he buys the Blackstone Imperial, this entire city changes." Damien studied the photos silently. Then his expression darkened slightly. "You think he actually likes her?" Claire's eyes narrowed. "I think he's interested." The words tasted poisonous coming out of her mouth. Meanwhile, 40 minutes away, Madeline Brooks sat beside her father's hospital bed, watching rain crawl across the window. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee. Samuel Brooks slept quietly beneath dim lights, his breathing uneven but steady. Madeline should have been resting. Instead, she kept replaying the gala inside her head, over and over again. Zayed's voice, his questions, the way he looked at her like she wasn't invisible. It didn't make sense. Nothing about him made sense. Her phone buzzed suddenly. Then again, and again, she frowned before opening the screen. Hundreds of notifications flooded social media. Messages, tags, photos. Her stomach dropped instantly. Oh no! Video clips from the ballroom had already spread everywhere. The comments grew worse the further she scrolled. She knows exactly what she's doing. Poor billionaire. She probably planned the whole thing. Madeline's chest tightened painfully. Then she saw the headlines beginning to appear. Plus-size hotel worker caught flirting with Arab billionaire. Mystery woman attached to Zayed Rahman after charity gala. She immediately locked the phone. Her hands trembled. Of course this would happen. Of course people would assume the worst. She should never have sat down at that table. Across town, inside a private suite at the Blackstone Imperial, Zayed Rahman silently watched the same headlines appear across multiple screens. His assistant Kareem stood nearby, looking furious. "Should we shut this down?" Kareem asked. "Legal already contacted several media outlets." Zayed remained quiet. One video replayed again. Madeline lowering her eyes while guests laughed around her. Another clip showed him placing the jacket around her shoulders. The comments underneath grew uglier by the minute. Gold digger, attention seeker, pathetic. His jaw tightened slightly. Kareem noticed immediately. "You're angry." "No," Zayed replied calmly. But Kareem knew him too well. Zayed only became this quiet when he was deeply angry. "She'll suffer because of this," Kareem said carefully. Zayed's eyes remained fixed on the screen. "Yes." For several seconds, silence filled the room. Then Zayed stood. "Where does she work tomorrow?" Kareem blinked. "You want to see her?" "No." The billionaire grabbed his coat. "I want to see the truth when nobody is watching." The next morning began before sunrise. Madeline arrived in the hotel bakery exhausted and emotionally drained. She hoped people downstairs hadn't seen the videos yet. She was wrong. The moment she entered the kitchen, conversations stopped. Not subtly, completely. Several employees exchanged glances immediately. One man smirked openly. "Well, look who's famous," another laughed. "Careful, she only talks to billionaires now." Madeline ignored them and walked toward her station. But humiliation followed anyway. "You should ask him to buy the bakery," one woman muttered loudly. A few others laughed. Madeline kept her face expressionless. That was the worst part about cruelty. People became bolder once they believed public opinion supported them. Grace Holloway approached quietly beside her. You okay? Madeline forced a smile again. I'm fine. Grace sighed softly. No, sweetheart. You're surviving. That's different. Before Madeline could answer, Noah Bennett suddenly appeared. Madeline. Office. Now. The kitchen immediately went silent again. Madeline's stomach sank. Inside Noah's office, tension filled the air instantly. Noah folded his hands awkwardly. There's concern about publicity. Madeline stared at him. I didn't do anything. That's not the issue. Then what is? Noah exhaled heavily. People are talking. Madeline almost laughed at the stupidity of it. People have always talked. This is different. Noah slid his tablet toward her. An article showed her photo beside Zayed's. Public speculation exploded underneath. Noah lowered his voice carefully. The hotel doesn't want scandals connected to staff. Madeline felt sick. So what are you saying? I'm saying maybe keep distance from Mr. Rahman. The unfairness of it nearly broke her composure. She had done nothing wrong. Nothing. Yet somehow she was the problem. Again. By noon, exhaustion crushed her emotionally. During lunch break, Madeline stepped outside the hotel through the employee entrance just to breathe. Cold wind rushed across the alley. She leaned against the brick wall and closed her eyes. Then she heard a familiar voice behind her. You skipped breakfast. Madeline turned instantly. Zayed Rahman stood near the alley entrance wearing a dark coat and simple clothes. No security, no cameras, just him. Her heartbeat stumbled. What are you doing here? Instead of answering, Zayed glanced toward the homeless man sitting near the sidewalk. Without hesitation, Madeline walked over and handed the man her untouched sandwich from lunch. Here, she said gently. It's still warm. The man looked shocked. Thank you. Zayed watched silently. Not the gesture itself. The instinct behind it. She gave away food even while struggling herself. No performance, no audience, just kindness. Madeline returned awkwardly. You shouldn't be here, she told him quietly. Why? Because people already think I'm using you. The words visibly affected him. You care what strangers think? I care because strangers decide everything. Zayed stared at her carefully. Then his voice lowered. Not everything. Before she could respond, a black luxury car suddenly stopped near the alley. Claire Whitmore stepped out wearing sunglasses and a perfectly tailored cream coat. The moment she saw them standing together, her expression hardened instantly. And Madeline suddenly realized with horrifying clarity. This nightmare was only beginning. By Friday evening, the entire city seemed to know Madeline Brooks's name, and not for the reasons she once dreamed. The Blackstone Imperial Hotel glittered beneath television cameras as luxury guests arrived for the Whitmore Foundation's annual investor banquet. Expensive gowns swept across marble floors, while reporters crowded the entrance hoping to catch another glimpse of billionaire Zayed Rahman. Inside the ballroom, giant digital screens glowed above the stage. Everything looked elegant, perfect, manufactured. Madeline stood alone near the service hallway, fighting the urge to leave. She should never have agreed to come. But Noah Bennett had insisted attendance was mandatory for staff visibility. The moment she entered the ballroom, she understood why. People were staring again, whispering again, judging again. Only now it felt worse, because everyone already thought they knew her story. Claire Whitmore noticed her immediately. A slow smile spread across her face. Predatory. There she is, Claire whispered to her friends. Madeline wore the only formal dress she owned, a simple navy blue gown that hugged her figure more tightly than she liked. She kept pulling nervously at the sleeves, wishing she could disappear into the walls. Several women nearby exchanged amused glances. She really came? She actually thinks he likes her. How embarrassing. Madeline lowered her eyes and kept walking, but humiliation followed her like a shadow. At the far end of the ballroom, Claire stepped onto the stage holding a microphone. "Good evening, everyone," she announced smoothly. Polite applause followed. Claire smiled with practiced elegance. "Tonight is about honesty, integrity, and protecting the reputation of our city's business community." Something about her tone immediately made Madeline uneasy. Then Claire's eyes slowly drifted toward her. "And unfortunately," Claire continued dramatically, "sometimes people attempt to manipulate generosity for personal gain." The room quieted. Madeline's stomach dropped. No. Claire snapped her fingers lightly. The massive ballroom screens flickered to life behind her. Photos suddenly appeared. Madeline sitting beside Zayed at the gala. Madeline wearing his jacket. Madeline speaking with him outside the hotel. Each image carefully cropped to look intimate, strategic, calculated. Gasps spread across the ballroom. Madeline froze completely. Claire sighed theatrically into the microphone. "Some individuals have used recent media attention to create false narratives for financial opportunity." People immediately turned toward Madeline. The whispers exploded. "Oh my God! She really planned this. I knew it." Madeline's face turned pale. "That's not true," she whispered. But her voice disappeared beneath the growing noise. Claire continued calmly. "We must protect respected investors from manipulation." A man near the front laughed quietly. "Looks like someone thought she won the lottery." Several guests smirked openly. Madeline's breathing became uneven. This wasn't embarrassment anymore. It was destruction. Public. Intentional. Cruel. Claire stepped down from the stage slowly and approached her directly while cameras continued flashing nearby. "You really should have stayed in the kitchen," Claire said softly enough that only Madeline could hear. Madeline's eyes filled instantly. "You did this on purpose." Claire tilted her head. "No, you did." Around them, people stared shamelessly now. Nobody defended her. Nobody stopped it. Even Noah Bennett remained silent near the ballroom entrance, too afraid to challenge wealthy donors. Madeline suddenly understood something painful. The truth didn't matter here. Power did. And people like Claire always won. "I never asked for any of this," Madeline whispered. Claire smiled coldly. "But you enjoyed the attention." "No, please," Claire laughed softly. "Women don't accidentally end up next to billionaires." The cruelty in her voice sliced straight through the little confidence Madeline still had left. Every old insecurity returned at once. Maybe Claire was right. Maybe she had been stupid for believing Zayed's kindness meant anything at all. Maybe everyone else saw the truth more clearly than she did. Tears burned behind her eyes. The ballroom lights suddenly felt blinding. Too many faces. Too many whispers. Too much humiliation. Madeline turned abruptly toward the exit. She needed to leave. Now. But before she could take more than 3 steps, the ballroom doors opened, and silence crashed across the room instantly. Zayed Rahman had arrived. The atmosphere changed immediately. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even Claire stiffened slightly. Zayed entered wearing a charcoal black suit with no expression on his face. Karim followed several steps behind him, along with 2 members of his security team. But it wasn't the bodyguards that frightened people. It was the look in Zayed's eyes. Cold. Focused. Dangerously calm. His gaze moved slowly across the ballroom screens, still displaying humiliating photos of Madeline. Then toward the crowd enjoying the spectacle. Then finally, toward Madeline herself. She stood frozen near the center of the ballroom, eyes red, shoulders trembling slightly beneath the lights. For a brief moment, pain crossed his expression. Real pain. Then it disappeared. Claire recovered first. "Mr. Rahman," she said smoothly, approaching him. "I'm glad you're here because there seems to have been a misunderstanding." "Move!" The single word stopped her instantly. The ballroom went completely silent. Zayed walked past Claire without even looking at her, straight toward Madeline. Guests watched breathlessly as he crossed the ballroom floor. Everyone expected the same thing: distance, rejection, a polite public separation to protect his reputation. Instead, Zayed stopped beside Madeline, close enough that she could feel the warmth from his presence, and without hesitation, he stood beside her, not behind her, not away from her, beside her. The room fell into stunned disbelief. Claire's confidence cracked visibly. "Zayed," she said carefully, "you don't understand what's happening." "No," he replied calmly. His eyes slowly lifted toward the screens. "I understand perfectly." Madeline looked at him helplessly. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered shakily. His expression softened slightly when he looked at her. "And leave you alone in this room?" The quiet sincerity in his voice shattered something inside her emotionally. For the first time all evening, she no longer felt invisible. Zayed turned toward the stage. "Who controls the screens?" Nobody answered immediately. Then Noah Bennett nervously raised a hand. I do, sir." Zayed nodded once. "Good." The billionaire slowly loosened his cufflinks with terrifying calm. Then he looked directly at the entire ballroom. "At first," he said quietly, "I believed tonight was about charity." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. "But now I realize it's about judgment." His voice remained soft, which somehow made it even more frightening. Zayed extended his hand toward the glowing screens behind Claire. "Since everyone here seems to enjoy humiliating people," he said slowly, "let's reveal the truth." Claire's face lost all color, and suddenly, for the very first time, she looked afraid. Nobody in the ballroom moved. Not the investors, not the reporters, not even Claire Whitmore. The silence pressing against the walls felt almost unbearable as Zayed Rahman stepped slowly toward the stage. Behind him, Madeline stood frozen, her heart pounding so hard she could barely hear the orchestra music fading into the background. Claire recovered first. "This is ridiculous," she snapped sharply. "You're making a scene over a misunderstanding." Zayed stopped walking. Then he turned toward her with terrifying calm. "A misunderstanding," he repeated softly. Claire lifted her chin defiantly. "Yes." For several long seconds, he simply looked at her, and somehow that silence frightened her more than shouting would have. Finally, Zayed glanced toward Noah Bennett. "Play the footage." Noah swallowed hard. "Sir, now." The ballroom screens flickered again. At first, guests expected more photos of Madeline, more humiliation. Instead, security footage appeared. The date stamp from the original charity gala flashed across the screens. Gasps spread instantly through the room. Claire's face drained of color. The footage showed the ballroom before dinner service. Claire and several friends standing together laughing near the VIP tables. The audio became clearer. "Put her next to him," Claire's voice said through the speakers. Several guests exchanged shocked looks. One woman covered her mouth. On screen, Claire pointed directly toward Madeline carrying dessert trays across the ballroom. "This is going to be hilarious," she laughed. The next clip appeared immediately after. Another camera angle. The waiter who spilled wine on Madeline stood near the kitchen entrance, speaking privately with Claire. Then, Claire slipped folded cash into his hand. The ballroom exploded into whispers. "Oh my God, she paid him. Are you serious?" The waiter sitting near the back turned completely pale. Claire immediately stepped toward the stage. That's out of context. But nobody was listening anymore. Another clip appeared. This time showing Claire instructing hotel staff to leak photos to bloggers after the gala. More evidence, more lies, more cruelty exposed beneath the ballroom lights. Madeline stared at the screens in disbelief. Her knees felt weak. The humiliation she thought she deserved had been manufactured deliberately from the beginning. Beside her, Zayed's expression remained controlled, but Karim recognized the anger hidden underneath it. Claire pointed furiously toward the screens. This proves nothing. No, Zayed replied calmly. His dark eyes slowly swept across the ballroom. It proves everything. The atmosphere shifted violently. Moments earlier, guests had mocked Madeline openly. Now those same people avoided eye contact entirely, because cruelty always looked uglier once exposed publicly. Claire's breathing became uneven. You don't understand what she's doing, she insisted desperately. Women like her know how to manipulate sympathy. Madeline flinched at the words, but before she could react, another voice suddenly echoed across the ballroom. No, Grace Holloway said firmly. Women like you do. Heads turned instantly. The older waitress slowly stepped forward from the edge of the ballroom, no longer looking timid or invisible. Something about her posture had changed completely. Grace walked toward the stage calmly, while guests stared in confusion. Claire frowned. What is this? Grace ignored her entirely. Instead, she looked directly at Zayed. I think it's time. Madeline blinked in confusion. Time for what? To everyone's shock, Zayed gave a small nod, like they already understood each other. The ballroom fell silent again. Grace turned slowly toward the crowd. My name is Grace Holloway, she said steadily. And before I became a waitress at this hotel, she paused. I spent 27 years as an investigative journalist. Gasps spread instantly. Claire's face went blank. Grace continued. For the last 4 years, I've quietly documented the behavior of wealthy donors, executives, and social elites inside this hotel. Several investors shifted nervously. What behavior? Someone whispered. Grace's eyes hardened. Cruelty disguised as sophistication. The room froze. Madeline stared at Grace in shock. You knew? She whispered. Grace turned toward her gently. Yes, sweetheart. Claire laughed bitterly. Oh, please. This is absurd. Grace calmly pulled a small flash drive from her pocket. I have recordings, she said. Messages, evidence. Years of humiliation aimed at employees who weren't wealthy enough, thin enough, attractive enough, or important enough. The ballroom suddenly felt smaller, claustrophobic, because many people in the room were realizing they might appear in those recordings. Grace looked directly at Claire. You thought humiliating Madeline would entertain people. Claire crossed her arms defensively. She wanted attention. No, Grace replied quietly. You wanted power. The sentence landed like a slap. Then came the biggest shock yet. Grace slowly turned toward the crowd again. And before tonight's gala, she continued, I personally contacted Mr. Rahman. Madeline's eyes widened. Claire looked horrified. Grace nodded toward Zayed. I recognized him immediately when he arrived at the hotel. Whispers exploded again. You knew who he was? Why didn't you say anything? Grace's voice softened slightly. Because I wanted to see whether powerful people would choose kindness when they believed nobody important was watching. Silence. Heavy. Painful. And they failed. Nobody breathed. Madeline suddenly understood. The prank had accidentally exposed everyone. Not her. Them. Tears burned behind her eyes. Meanwhile, Claire's entire composure finally cracked. You set me up! She shouted furiously. No, Zayed said calmly. You revealed yourself. The ballroom fell silent again. Claire looked around desperately for support, but nobody stepped forward anymore. Not even Damian Whitmore, because the social balance had completely changed, and everyone knew it. Then Zayed did something nobody expected. Instead of humiliating Claire further, he walked back toward Madeline. The ballroom cameras immediately followed him. Madeline's pulse pounded painfully. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered shakily. Zayed stopped in front of her. His expression softened. "Because someone should have done it a long time ago." Before she could answer, he turned toward the stage and extended his hand toward her. The room held its breath. "Come with me." Madeline froze. "What?" "Please." She looked terrified. Thousands of eyes watched her. Every insecurity inside her screamed not to move. But something in Zayed's voice felt safe. Slowly, trembling slightly, Madeline placed her hand in his. The ballroom erupted into stunned whispers again. Zayed guided her onto the stage beside him. Not behind him, beside him. Then he faced the crowd. "When I entered this ballroom," he said calmly, "I saw people pretending to be impressive," and his gaze swept across the silent guests. "But the only person here who never pretended to be someone else," he looked directly at Madeline, "was her." Madeline's eyes filled instantly. Several people in the audience lowered their heads in shame. Then came the next shock. Zayed reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder. "I spent the last 48 hours reviewing bakery investment proposals across Chicago," he announced. Confused murmurs spread through the ballroom. Zayed placed the folder gently into Madeline's trembling hands. "Inside that folder," he said softly, "is a complete investment agreement for your bakery." The entire ballroom gasped. Claire looked physically sick. Madeline stared at him speechlessly. "What? You said you dreamed of building a place where people wouldn't feel judged." His voice remained calm. "So build it." Tears rolled down Madeline's face before she could stop them. The ballroom stood frozen in disbelief. But then, Zayed leaned slightly closer to her and quietly whispered something that changed everything. "This isn't the first time we've met." Madeline's breath caught instantly. Because somehow, deep inside, part of her suddenly realized he might be telling the truth. The ballroom no longer felt real. Madeline Brooks stood frozen beneath the chandeliers, clutching the investment folder against her chest while hundreds of stunned guests stared at her in disbelief. But she barely noticed them anymore, because of what Zayed had whispered. "This isn't the first time we've met." The words echoed inside her head again and again. Her breathing turned shallow. "That's impossible," she whispered. Zayed looked at her quietly. "Is it?" Around them, reporters scrambled to ask questions while guests whispered in confusion. Claire Whitmore stood near the back of the ballroom, looking completely shattered, but even her humiliation faded into the background now. Madeline could only focus on him. His eyes. The strange familiarity hidden behind them. "Have we met before?" she asked softly. Zayed studied her face for several seconds before answering. "Yes." The certainty in his voice sent chills through her. "But where?" Instead of replying immediately, Zayed gently took the investment folder from her trembling hands and guided her away from the crowd. "Come with me." This time she followed without resisting. The ballroom doors closed behind them, muting the chaos instantly. The hallway outside felt strangely quiet after the emotional storm inside. Rain tapped softly against tall hotel windows while distant traffic glowed below the Chicago skyline. Madeline finally turned toward him. "Please stop talking like this," she said shakily. You're scaring me. For the first time since arriving at the banquet, Zayed's expression softened completely. I'm not trying to scare you. Then tell me what's happening. He hesitated, and that hesitation alone told her whatever truth he carried mattered deeply. Before he could answer, Grace Holloway slowly approached them from the ballroom entrance. You should tell her, Grace said gently. Madeline looked between them in confusion. You both knew? Grace nodded. Yes. Madeline stared at her in disbelief. How long? Grace smiled sadly. Longer than you think. Madeline suddenly felt overwhelmed again. Too many revelations. Too many emotions. Her entire life seemed to be changing faster than her mind could process it. Zayed noticed immediately. You need air. Before she could argue, he quietly led her toward a private rooftop terrace connected to the ballroom level. The moment they stepped outside, cold wind wrapped around them. Chicago stretched endlessly beneath the rain. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Madeline hugged her arms tightly. Finally, Zayed broke the silence. 7 years ago, he said quietly, I came to Chicago after my mother died. Madeline looked at him carefully. There was a funeral in Dubai, business meetings afterward, endless condolences from people who cared more about inheritance than grief. His jaw tightened slightly. I couldn't breathe anymore. The vulnerability in his voice surprised her. So did the loneliness. I disappeared for a few days, he continued. No assistance, no security, no family. His eyes drifted toward the rain-soaked skyline. I remember walking for hours in the middle of winter. Something inside Madeline stirred faintly. Not memory exactly, but feeling. Zayed slowly looked back at her. And eventually, he said softly, I collapsed outside a bakery. Madeline's heartbeat skipped. A strange image flashed briefly through her mind. Snow, rain, a dark coat, a tired man sitting against a window. She frowned immediately. No. Zayed watched her carefully. You remember something? I don't know. Her voice trembled slightly now. It's blurry. Grace stepped quietly onto the terrace behind them. There used to be a small bakery on Clark Street, she said gently. You worked there nights before your father got sick. Madeline turned toward her instantly. How do you know that? Grace smiled faintly. Because I used to buy coffee there every morning. The memories started moving faster now. Old neon lights glowing through snow. Exhaustion. Burned coffee. An unfamiliar man sitting alone in the rain. Madeline pressed her fingers against her forehead. Oh my God. Zayed took one slow step closer. You came outside because you thought I was homeless. Her eyes widened. You sat beside me for nearly 3 hours. The memory crashed into her completely. A freezing Chicago night. A stranger sitting against the bakery window looking emotionally destroyed. She remembered offering him coffee. Remembered giving him her scarf because his hands were shaking from cold rain. And suddenly, she remembered the watch. The expensive watch he tried to give her afterward. You refused it, Zayed said quietly. Madeline stared at him speechlessly. I told you I didn't want money. You told me something else too. His voice lowered softly. People don't need luxury when they're hurting. They need kindness. Tears instantly filled Madeline's eyes because she remembered saying those exact words. Back then, she never knew who he was. To her, he had simply looked lost. Broken. Human. I didn't recognize you, she whispered emotionally. I know. Why didn't you tell me at the gala? Zayed looked away briefly toward the city lights. because I wanted to know whether kindness was still real, or whether I had imagined that night. The honesty in his voice shattered her emotionally. For years, she believed nobody remembered her existence unless they wanted something from her. Yet this man, this billionaire the entire world feared and admired, had remembered a single act of compassion for 7 years. Madeline wiped tears from her cheeks shakily. "You remembered me all this time?" "Yes." The answer came instantly, without hesitation, without doubt. "And when I saw you at the gala," his expression darkened slightly. "Watching people humiliate you," his voice tightened. "I realized the kindest person I ever met had spent years believing she deserved cruelty." Madeline looked down immediately, because part of her still believed it. Zayed stepped closer carefully. "You asked me why I was being kind to you." She nodded weakly. "It's because you saved something in me a long time ago." The wind swept softly across the terrace. Below them, Chicago traffic glowed like rivers of light. Grace quietly smiled from the doorway before leaving them alone. For several seconds, only silence remained. Then Zayed reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an old, faded bakery receipt, folded carefully in half. Madeline stared at it in shock. "You kept that? For 7 years?" Her breath caught painfully. The receipt still carried faint coffee stains, and on the back, in rushed handwriting, was the sentence she had scribbled for a grieving stranger during a snowstorm. "You are not alone tonight." Madeline finally broke completely. Tears streamed freely down her face as years of insecurity, humiliation, and loneliness collapsed under the weight of one impossible truth. Someone had seen her kindness long before the world mocked her appearance, and he had never forgotten. But then Zayed quietly said something else that made her heart stop again. "The bakery from that night still exists," he said softly. Madeline blinked through tears. "What?" A faint smile touched his face. "I bought the building yesterday. The old bakery still smelled like cinnamon." Madeline stood frozen just inside the doorway while morning sunlight spilled across worn wooden floors and dust floated gently through the air. Her throat tightened painfully. "I thought this place closed years ago," she whispered. Zayed Rahman stood quietly beside her, with his hands in his coat pockets. "It did." Madeline slowly walked farther inside. The tiny bakery on Clark Street looked smaller than she remembered. The faded menu boards still hung crooked behind the counter. One cracked window near the front remained patched with old tape from a winter storm years earlier. And suddenly, she was 23 again, exhausted, working double shifts, trying to survive. She could almost hear the old espresso machine steaming in the background, almost see herself wiping tables alone at midnight. Tears burned behind her eyes again. "You really bought this?" Zayed nodded once. 3 days ago." Madeline turned toward him in disbelief. "Why would you do that?" His answer came quietly. "Because you loved this place before the world convinced you to stop dreaming." The words hit her harder than she expected. For years, life had become survival instead of hope. Hospital bills, long shifts, cruel comments, loneliness. Somewhere along the way, the girl who once designed bakery sketches during lunch breaks had disappeared. And somehow, Zayed had remembered her dreams better than she had. Outside, reporters and social media exploded with coverage from the scandal at the Blackstone Imperial. News channels replayed Claire Whitmore's exposed schemes nonstop. But inside the old bakery, none of that noise seemed to matter. Only this moment did. Madeline slowly approached the old counter. Her fingers brushed against the faded glass display case. "I used to stand here every morning at 5, she said softly. Most customers barely looked at me. Zayed leaned against the doorway, quietly listening. But one little girl came in every Saturday with her grandmother. A faint smile touched her lips. She always bought strawberry muffins and told me my pastries looked magical. She laughed weakly through tears. I think she was the only customer who ever noticed how hard I worked. Zayed watched her carefully. That's not true. Madeline looked at him. You noticed, he said. The silence between them deepened emotionally. For the first time in years, Madeline no longer felt invisible. Later that afternoon, construction teams began arriving outside the bakery, carrying equipment and renovation plans. Word had spread across Chicago that billionaire investor Zayed Rahman was reopening the historic Clark Street bakery with Madeline Brooks as owner. Crowds gathered almost immediately. Not mocking crowds this time. Supportive ones. People brought flowers, handwritten notes. One elderly woman hugged Madeline outside the building and whispered, "Thank you for standing up to people like them." Madeline nearly cried again. Everything felt surreal. Only 1 week earlier, strangers laughed at her inside luxury ballrooms. Now strangers were defending her online, not because her appearance changed, but because the truth finally had a voice louder than cruelty. Inside the bakery, Grace Holloway supervised workers while pretending not to enjoy herself too much. You know, Grace said while reviewing renovation sketches, watching rich people panic on live television might be my favorite retirement hobby. Madeline laughed unexpectedly, a real laugh this time. Grace smiled warmly. There she is. Madeline blinked. What? The woman you used to be before shame exhausted her. The sentence lingered painfully. Because Grace was right. For years, humiliation had slowly stolen parts of her personality piece by piece, confidence, joy, curiosity, even laughter. But somehow Zayed had started pulling those pieces back into the light. As evening approached, Samuel Brooks arrived at the bakery for the first time since leaving the hospital. Madeline nearly cried, seeing him step carefully through the doorway. Her father looked around slowly, in amazement. You did all this? Madeline shook her head emotionally. No, he did. Samuel's eyes drifted toward Zayed, standing near the window. The older man slowly approached him. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Samuel quietly said, My daughter spent years believing nobody saw her worth. Zayed's expression softened. I saw it immediately. Samuel looked down briefly. You have no idea how rare that is. The words carried the weight of a father who had helplessly watched the world damage his child for years. Zayed understood that pain more than he admitted aloud, because he remembered his own mother crying quietly after cruel comments about her appearance during public events in Dubai. He remembered how deeply judgment wounded good people. And he remembered promising himself one day he would never become the kind of man who ignored cruelty just because it was socially acceptable. Outside, snow began falling softly across Chicago streets. Inside the bakery, warmth slowly returned to a place abandoned by hope years earlier. 3 weeks later, the grand opening arrived. The line outside stretched around the block before sunrise. News vans crowded the street while customers filled the sidewalk carrying flowers and cameras. Above the entrance, a new sign glowed warmly. Brooks and Rahman Bakery. Madeline stared at it emotionally. You put my name first. Zayed adjusted his coat calmly. It was always your dream first. Inside, the bakery transformed beautifully. Warm lights, fresh bread, soft music. Exactly the kind of place Madeline once described at the gala. A place where nobody felt judged walking in. Customers flooded through the doors, smiling excitedly. Some recognized her from television. Others simply came because they believed in what the bakery represented now. Kindness. Second chances. human dignity. Madeline moved behind the counter carefully, overwhelmed by emotion. "You ready?" Grace asked. Madeline looked around the bakery one more time, then nodded. "Yes." The morning passed in joyful chaos. Laughter, coffee cups, children pressing faces against pastry displays. For the first time in years, Madeline worked without fear of judgment hanging over her shoulders. Then suddenly, the front door opened again, and the atmosphere shifted instantly. Claire Whitmore stepped inside. The bakery fell silent. Claire looked nothing like the confident socialite from the gala. Dark circles shadowed beneath her eyes, and media scandals had clearly destroyed much of her carefully built reputation. Several customers glared openly. Madeline stiffened behind the counter. Claire approached slowly. "I just wanted to say..." Her voice trembled slightly. "I'm sorry." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Claire looked genuinely broken now. "I thought humiliating people made me powerful," she admitted quietly. "I didn't realize how ugly I had become." Madeline stared at her for several seconds. The old version of herself would have accepted the apology immediately just to avoid conflict. But this version, the version rebuilding herself, understood something important. Forgiveness did not erase damage. "Still," she answered softly, "I hope someday you learn to see people before judging them." Claire lowered her eyes silently. Then she left. The bakery slowly returned to life again. But across the room, Zayed watched Madeline carefully. Admiration filled his expression now. Not because she was perfect, but because even after everything, she still chose grace over cruelty. And that, to him, was rarer than beauty. Later that night, after the bakery closed, Zayed stood beside Madeline beneath the glowing sign outside. Snow drifted softly around them. Then quietly, almost nervously, he confessed something that changed the air between them forever. "I didn't just reopen the bakery for you," he admitted. Madeline looked up slowly. Zayed's dark eyes held hers steadily. "I think," he said softly, "I came back to Chicago because part of me never stopped searching for you." Snow covered Chicago in silver the night Zayed Rahman changed everything. 3 months had passed since the scandal at the Blackstone Imperial Hotel, but people across the city still talked about the moment the billionaire stood beside Madeline Brooks while an entire ballroom tried to destroy her. Only now, the story meant something different. The old bakery on Clark Street had become more than a business. It had become a symbol. Every morning, customers lined up before sunrise for Madeline's pastries and coffee. Families gathered beneath warm lights. Students studied at corner tables. Elderly couples shared cinnamon rolls beside the windows. Nobody laughed at people there. Nobody whispered cruel comments about appearances. Inside Brooks and Rahman Bakery, people felt safe. And somehow, that mattered more than luxury ever had. Madeline stood behind the counter, finishing fresh strawberry tarts, when Grace Holloway entered carrying a newspaper. "You're on the front page again," Grace announced dramatically. Madeline groaned immediately. "Please tell me it's not another article about my dress size." Grace grinned. "Nope." She slid the paper across the counter. "Local bakery inspires national conversation about kindness." Beneath the headline was a photograph of Madeline laughing beside a little girl holding cupcakes. No humiliation. No cruelty. Just happiness. Madeline stared quietly at the photo for several seconds. "I still can't believe any of this is real." Grace softened slightly. "That's because you spent too long believing you deserved pain." Before Madeline could answer, the bakery door opened. Zayed walked inside carrying snow across his dark coat. And despite everything that had happened between them over the last few months, Madeline's heart still reacted every single time she saw him. Not because he was a billionaire, but because he looked at her differently than anyone else ever had. Like she mattered before she proved herself. Like she deserved gentleness without earning it. The moment Zayed entered, several customers smiled warmly at him, not because of his wealth, because they knew him now. The man who stayed late helping clean tables after closing. The man who remembered employees' birthdays. The man who quietly paid for coffee whenever struggling customers came inside. He walked toward Madeline slowly. "You're overworking again," he said calmly. She smiled faintly. "And you're still bossy." Grace laughed loudly in the background. "I'm suddenly very busy elsewhere." Both of them ignored her. Outside the bakery windows, snow continued falling softly across Clark Street. Zayed leaned slightly against the counter. "There's an event tonight." Madeline narrowed her eyes suspiciously. "What kind of event?" "A charity fundraiser," she groaned instantly. "Absolutely not." A faint smile touched his face. "You haven't even heard the rest. I already hate it." "Madeline." "No," Zayed laughed quietly under his breath. The sound still surprised her every time. Before meeting her, people rarely made him laugh naturally anymore. Everything in his old world felt calculated, performative, transactional. But this felt real. "I need you there tonight," he said softly. Something in his tone made her pause. "Why?" "You'll see." 3 hours later, black SUVs stopped outside the newly renovated Raman Grand Hotel downtown. Madeline stepped out carefully wearing a dark emerald dress Grace had practically forced her to buy. The entrance glittered beneath camera flashes. Her stomach tightened immediately. "I hate cameras." Zayed offered his arm calmly. "I know. Then why are you smiling?" "Because you're still here anyway." Inside the ballroom, hundreds of guests turned toward them immediately. But this time, the atmosphere felt completely different from the Whitmore Gala months earlier. No mocking, no cruel whispers. People actually applauded when Madeline entered beside Zayed. The sound nearly overwhelmed her emotionally. Across the room, reporters gathered near the stage while giant screens displayed the logo for a newly announced organization, the Holloway Foundation for Human Dignity. Madeline frowned slightly. "What is this?" Zayed guided her closer toward the stage. "You remember what you said about wanting a place where nobody feels judged?" She nodded slowly. "Well," he replied softly, "I realized bakeries shouldn't be the only places like that." And confused murmurs spread through the ballroom as Zayed stepped onto the stage beside Grace Holloway. The older woman looked genuinely emotional for once. Zayed adjusted the microphone quietly. "When I first came to Chicago," he began calmly, "I believed wealth protected people from loneliness." The ballroom fell silent. "I was wrong." His eyes slowly moved toward Madeline, standing near the front of the crowd. "The cruelest rooms I've ever stood inside were filled with powerful people." Nobody moved, but kindness. His voice softened slightly. Kindness came from someone society barely noticed. Madeline's eyes filled instantly. Several reporters lowered their cameras slightly. Zayed continued. "For years, people taught Madeline Brooks she should feel ashamed for existing exactly as she was." The room remained completely silent now. And yet, despite every humiliation she suffered, she continued showing compassion to strangers. He glanced briefly toward Grace. To employees. To customers. To a grieving man sitting alone in the rain. Madeline's chest tightened painfully. Then Zayed revealed the final surprise. "Tonight," he announced, "Rahman Global Holdings is donating partial ownership of the Raman Grand Hotel to the Holloway Foundation." Gasps exploded across the ballroom. Reporters nearly shouted over one another. Madeline stared at him in total disbelief. A luxury hotel, worth hundreds of millions, given away. Zayed calmly continued speaking through the chaos. The foundation will support individuals facing discrimination based on appearance, body size, social status, and financial hardship. People across the ballroom rose slowly to their feet. Applause thundered through the room. Not polite applause, emotional applause. The kind that comes when people suddenly realize they are witnessing something real. Madeline could barely breathe. She stepped toward the stage, shakily. "You're giving away part of your hotel?" Zayed looked at her steadily. "I'm investing in something more valuable." Her eyes filled with tears. "What?" He smiled softly. "A world where people like you never spend years believing they're unworthy of love." The sentence broke something open inside her completely. For so long, Madeline believed beauty belonged only to certain people. Confidence belonged only to certain people. Love belonged only to certain people. But standing there beneath the ballroom lights, with an entire room applauding not her appearance, but her heart, she finally understood how wrong the world had been. Zayed stepped closer carefully. "You changed my life years ago with kindness," he said softly. "And you changed mine by reminding me I deserved it too." The ballroom erupted into applause again as he gently took her hand. No games, no pity, no humiliation, only truth. And for the first time in her life, Madeline Brooks no longer felt like someone the world needed to apologize for seeing. She felt seen, fully, completely, beautifully. And somewhere beyond the ballroom windows, snow continued falling softly across Chicago, covering old cruelty beneath something cleaner, something kinder, something new. True beauty was never about appearance. It was about the people who chose compassion in a world that rewarded cruelty, and sometimes, the kindest hearts were hidden inside the people society underestimated most. Kindness matters more than status. Never judge someone by appearance, because the people the world ignores often carry the most beautiful souls. True character reveals itself in difficult moments, and compassion has the power to completely change someone's life. If this story touched your heart, comment where you're watching from, share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe for more emotional stories like this.